Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hatman Strikes Back. Daily boxing news. How we doing, people? Shout out to everybody in the live chat. No long intro this evening. Big up Mr. Luca early. He says, Alan to quit against Hergovic, question mark. Thoughts? You know what? That's a good shout, because somebody in the Element group was predicting that Alan doesn't go 7 rounds. And I thought to myself, well, Alan's got a really good chin. He has been stopped several times, but never down. And Hergovic is not really a big puncher. He's an average puncher, by my estimation. A consistent puncher. He throws a lot of shots. But Alan did quit against Fraser Clark. I know Jamie Moore came out and said, no, he didn't, but he's just trying to protect his fighter's reputation. I'll go with what the fighter himself said. Dave Allen quit in the fight. That's no shade at Dave Allen. I've always said I don't come down harshly on fighters who quit in tough fights. I'm not the one in there taking the punches. All right? But just to be literal about it, yes, Dave Allen quit against Fraser Clark. Does Fraser Clark hit any harder than Hergovic? Probably not. So, yeah, maybe Hergovic gets him out of there. But I certainly wouldn't discount the possibility that it goes the distance, because Alan knows how to get through the rounds. He's got a very good chin. When he wants to go full-on defensive mode, he can do it. So, yeah, it's either going to be a Hergovic stoppage, Alan corner retirement. A Hergovic stoppage by way of, should I say, Alan corner retirement. Or, I don't know, Alan flat out quitting or something. Or it'll go the distance. And Hergovic will win literally every round. Anyway, we'll come on to that, but big up Luca for the super chat early. First round boxing, big up. Big up Waved, Austin Spear. Jay Ward, big up Dominica. Rastafari, that's right. Shout out to JM Encircled. Is it Abu Zanaya? Chris Santos, Julius, Striker, big up Truth Channel, Goozy, Tony, Vengeance. Shout out to Rich Franklin, Sean, Ashley, Atavistic Intellect. Okay, let's get into some boxing news and boxing talk here. Right away, we got 68 concurrent viewers. If everyone can stick a like on this stream, it will be much appreciated. It really helps these streams get seen. So if we can get these likes up to about 40, we've got 81 concurrent viewers now. If everyone can stick a like on this stream, please, folks. Really, really helps me. Thank you in advance. So, Itauma versus Franklin weigh-in happened earlier on today. Itauma weighed in at 242 pounds. In English money, that is 17 stone 4 pounds. For those of you still using the English system, I, for boxing purposes at least, tend to go with the American pounds. Obviously, an American pound is the same as an English pound, but they don't use the stone aspect, right? They just stick with the pounds. So that's 17 stone 4 in English money, 242 US pounds. Jermaine Franklin weighed in at 258.5. That is 18 stone 6. Yeah, it's 18 stone 6 because 252 is 18 stone in English money again. So, yeah, that's 18 stone 6 for Jermaine Franklin. Now, if we look historically at what Itauma has weighed before, and in fact, we could just look at Itauma's physique here. He looks in good nick. There's no excess body weight there. You know, Itauma is not an Anthony Joshua body type. He's not somebody that's super chiseled and extremely lean and all that kind of thing. No, he's more like a Larry Holmes type physique when Holmes was young and in shape, where he has more striated muscles and, you know, he's not really ripped up. Even Muhammad Ali, right? When he was in his championship days, he wasn't a really ripped up character. And Itauma has that kind of physique, which is often a good physique for boxing, as opposed to the extremely cut up, chiseled muscle physique. So, yeah, that's Itauma. And again, if we look at the weights historically for him, on the left-hand side, you'll see Itauma's weights. And on the right of center, you'll see his opponent's weights over the past 7 fights. So there you go, 242 for Franklin, 235 against White, 254 against Balogan, 249 against McKean, 239 against Wack, 239 for the previous fight before that, and 240, well, pretty much 242 actually against Dan Garber. And that was back in March of 2024. So we're talking about just over a year ago. So yeah, that's a good weight for Itauma, 242. No problem whatsoever. He's in good condition. And Franklin coming in heavy, and Franklin's weight fluctuates all over the place. I don't think this is going to be good for him. If Franklin was really going to cause Itauma some serious issues, you'd want to see him come in at not a ridiculously lightweight, because that could suggest that he's maybe lost the weight too fast, but trimmer than normal. And he hasn't done that. You know, Franklin, not a particularly tall guy. What is he, 6'2"? And he's come in as heavy as he is. Yeah, not looking good for him. But then again, who would be picking Jermaine Franklin to win the fight? Not many. Shout out to Jake Isaac in from Bulgaria. Wave says Franklin super disappointing. He had some extra time with a cancellation to be in prime shape, and he is close to his heaviest weight ever. That's right. Tony says Moses looked more muscular than we've seen before. I don't know if he's more muscular. I don't know. Maybe he's just higher muscle to fat ratio. I guess you could construe that as being more muscular. Seb says, after seeing Franklin's weight, I'm confident it ends in under 4 or 5 rounds now for sure. Well, it might, but it depends. Franklin coming in this heavy suggests that, yeah, he hasn't had the greatest camp. He hasn't been the most disciplined. It could also suggest he doesn't have that much ambition. But therein lies a potential issue. Franklin is a good survivor. He's got a good chin. He's obviously been around the gyms and all that kind of stuff for many, many years. If he goes in there thinking that I just want to get through the fight without getting chinned, he might actually stand a better chance of making it through the fight. Whereas if he goes in there at this weight or even at a lighter weight and actually tries to put it on Itauma, there's more chance perhaps that he actually gets stopped. So even though it sounds counterintuitive, it might be the case that this is an indication he's going to go full-on sparring partner defensive mode and make it very, very difficult for Itauma to stop him. And in fact, I want to show you guys a screenshot because somebody, again, in the Element group pointed something out. And it could be nothing. I'm not saying it's something, but it could be nothing. Then again, who knows? So this right here, if I can get it up on screen, this right here is a screenshot from Queensbury Promotions YouTube channel. It was a video of Itauma arriving at the final press conference the other day. And as he left the car and walked towards the building, he appeared to be limping. And people were wondering, well, does this guy have some type of injury? He definitely appears to be limping. Is he trying to bring back the old school bop? Because that's what we used to call it back in the days. People would walk around limping deliberately because it was like it was actually a thing that kind of came from the Caribbean, Jamaica and other Caribbean countries. People had this trend of walking with a limp deliberately, right? It was a funny thing. Is Itauma trying to bring the bop back? Or was he suffering from some kind of injury? Maybe his leg was numb from sitting in the car for too long or sitting in a particular way. I don't know. But it's something worth noting. Have any of you guys in the chat actually seen this? Goozy says, I heard Franklin say he loves being the underdog for this fight. Yeah, well, he would say that. Trolls About says Itauma does look 6'4" here if Franklin is really 6'2". Yeah, for me, Itauma's always looked 6'4". There have been lots of people who've claimed Itauma's much shorter than 6'4". People that have seen him in person, oh, he's no way 6'4". See, what you get is people who are jealous of other people's heights, and I find it very strange. So when they see him in person, there's this compulsion to want to act like they're shorter than they really are. I've never understood why people do that. But no, Itauma's 6'4". If you saw him face off with Dylan White, he was clearly taller. So he's a legit 6'4". He always has been. Afro Jam says, this was a bad cherry pick. Franklin is done. A cherry pick? I mean, I wouldn't call it a cherry pick myself. Itauma's 13-0. See, the problem for Itauma is that, and this is a thing with modern professional boxing, is that due to social media and the size and the power of these promoters now, you get a guy who's 13-0, and there's so much of a promotional push behind him that people want to put him in the same sentence as the very top guys in the division already. And that creates a desire by the public to see him in against those guys almost immediately. And I pointed something out to a Mike Tyson fan who turned up in the comments of one of my recent Itauma videos. And he was saying that Mike Tyson at the same stage of his career was undisputed champion. At the same stage of the career that Itauma is now, which is obviously complete nonsense. He was trying to make out as though because Itauma is 21 and Mike Tyson was undisputed at 21, that's the same stage of their career. No. Mike Tyson, I think, became undisputed in his 31st fight. Itauma's had 13 fights. He's had nearly 20 fights less than Mike Tyson had by the time he became undisputed. That is obviously not the same stage of the career, is it? It's the same age, but that is something totally different from the same stage of the career. And obviously Mike Tyson fans will say, well, that proves how great Tyson was because he had so many fights in such a short space of time. Well, most of the fights he had were against absolute cream puffs, truth be told. In his first, whatever it was, 26, 27 fights before he challenged Berbick, there was some decent names chucked in there as well, but the vast majority of them were cream puffs, okay? And certainly his first 13 fights were against cream puffs. Mike Tyson being that active wasn't so much about how amazing a talent he was, and he was a great talent, but it was more so about the position he was in, the unique position, whereby he turned pro with the same team he was with as an amateur. And that team were a pro team. You know, Costamato was a professional coach, not just an amateur coach, and a mentor. And he had loads of links in the professional game because of the fact that he'd been managing and training fighters for decades and decades and decades before he got Mike Tyson. So Mike Tyson hit the ground running, and with Bill Caton and Jimmy Jacobs, they had a tremendous relationship with various network bosses, other promoters, and this allowed them to get Mike Tyson out on other people's shows all the time. Whereas Itauma has been locked down to Frank Warren. He can't fight on other people's shows. And that limits the amount of times he can fight in the first 2 years of his career, whereas Mike Tyson was free to fight on loads of different people's shows. And that's why he was able to fight once a month minimum in the first 2 years of his career, sometimes twice a month. All right? So I'm sure Itauma would love to fight that frequently, but it's just not possible, unfortunately, in the current boxing landscape. So it's not about, oh, Mike Tyson was so amazing, that's why he fought so frequently in the first 2 years of his career. No, because there are actually fighters who were nowhere near as good as Mike Tyson or Itauma that fought more frequently than that in the first 2 years of their careers. Oh yes, it was quite a common thing back in the old days, decades ago. You'd have fighters that would fight, once, twice a month. I mean, Journeyman, for example, will fight sometimes once every couple of weeks. Peter Buckley, a famous UK journeyman who had over 300 professional fights, he was sometimes fighting twice a month, I'm going to say twice a week. So yeah, it's more about the position you're in managerially, contractually, so on and so forth, as far as how often you can get out. This is Itauma's 14th fight against Franklin. If you look at the quality of opposition he's faced so far, I would say it's actually a bit better than the opposition Mike Tyson fought in his first 13 fights. Is it better than the first 13 opponents for Lennox Lewis? Lewis's first 13 opponents might have been a bit better than Itauma's. When did he fight Gary Mason? Was that in his 14th fight? Gary Mason was definitely better than anyone Itauma has fought. So I think Franklin is a perfectly reasonable fight. I don't see it as a bad cherry pick or anything like that. This is a prospect at the end of the day. Forget all the noise, forget the ranking and all this other stuff. Just look at where Itauma is actually at. 13-0, coming off a layoff, just beat Dylan White. Get in there against the guy like Franklin, who okay, he lost to Dylan White, but it was a debatable result, a debatable decision. Some people think that Dylan White was fortunate to get the decision in that fight. And Franklin is much more durable than White. He's never been down in a fight, never been stopped. And in fact, to this Itauma criticism and expectation, I want to talk about some comments from Gabe Rosado. Shout out to everybody in the live chat. I'll be on to your questions and comments in just a moment. But yeah, Gabe Rosado said something which I found really odd in this roundtable, if you can call it that. This latest podcast on the Ring Magazine, Inside the Ring, episode 29. Gabe Rosado said if Itauma doesn't get Franklin out of there early, then there's a big question mark next to him. Because he's supposed to, according to Rosado, do exactly that. And if he can't, then it shows he's not up there with the big boys in the division. Now, the reason I find that so curious is because a couple of years ago, Franklin went the distance with Dylan White and Anthony Joshua. And for context, Anthony Joshua was coming off 2 points defeats to Alexander Usyk. This was long before AJ had been chinned by Daniel Dubois. Okay, so he's coming off 2 points losses to Usyk, the second of which he was somewhat competitive in. That guy then fights Jermaine Franklin and gets taken the distance and doesn't come close to stopping him. So if a top 10 heavyweight, as AJ was then, a former 2-time world heavyweight champion, a guy that's just been the distance with Usyk twice, can't stop Franklin, then why does Itauma's potential inability to stop Franklin, when he's only 13-0, mean that there's a big question mark next to him? I don't get it. I find it really, really strange that there will be such an expectation of this young man when a former two-time heavyweight champion couldn't get Franklin out of there. Dillian Whyte couldn't get Franklin. I don't get it. I just don't get it. If this fight goes the distance, and by the way, Dave Allen is predicting that Franklin will take Itauma the distance. I don't see it as any kind of, bad sign for Moses Itauma. I mean, depending on how the fight plays out, but let's say Itauma wins every round and Franklin just hangs tough. I won't see it as a bad sign for Itauma. Did Mike Tyson, again, this revered puncher, not get taken the distance by Mitch Green and James Tillis? And James Tillis had been stopped a bunch of times in his career. Mike Tyson couldn't stop him. See, that's different, actually, to if Itauma went the distance with Franklin. Because because Itauma's never been stopped. Franklin's never been stopped. Never even been down. Tillis had not only been stopped, he'd been down in his career prior to going the distance with Mike Tyson. Right? Mike Tyson went the distance with Mitch Green. Mike Tyson nearly went the distance with Jose Revolta. He stopped him, I think it was in the 10th. So if a young Mike Tyson on the way up is being taken all these rounds and going the distance with these journeyman fighters, why would it be so horrifying and disappointing and such a stain on Itauma's record if he goes the distance with Franklin? I just don't get it. I think people are focusing more on the promotional push, the hype, and not focusing on where he's actually at in his career. He's only 13-0. You know what I mean? This is not a 24-0 guy. This is a 13-0 guy. And yes, there's all this talk linking into Usyk and this, that. That's just all promotional noise. Put all that aside. Just think about where he's actually at in his development as a fighter, where he's at in his career. 13-0, even though he was fighting at a high level as a junior in the amateurs, he only had like 23, 24 amateur fights total. So this is not a guy like Lomachenko coming out of the amateurs with hundreds of fights. This is a guy who had a short, blazing amateur career, of which most of his fights were fought as a junior, not as a senior. So he did fight in international tournaments. He was in the European Championships. He breezed through everybody there, so on and so forth. But there isn't a depth in his resume, okay, of experience. It's just a short, high-quality amateur career as a junior. I'm not sure if he even had any senior belts. But I'm not saying he didn't. I'm saying I'm not sure. So yeah, the expectations with Itauma are a little wild. A little wild at this stage. I think Franklin is a perfectly acceptable opponent for where he's at in his career now. Again, putting all the hype aside. He's a 13-0 prospect. We'll come on to Fundora in just a second. And Keith Thurman, the height difference looks crazy. Let's just get this picture back. Here we go. Itauma Franklin. Shout out to Gaz for the super chat. He says, I've got Franklin on points. He can do this. Okay. Shout out to Gaz. He's expecting the upset. He's picking the upset. Paladin Poker says, White buzzed him a little. I'd say he wasn't in serious danger. Diaz says, Franklin has not been stopped at red traffic lights either. I'm not sure what that comment means. Goozy says, I would assume no one with the name wants to fight Itauma. I'm sure anyone would fight Itauma if they're being paid enough money. But for the money, because that's the kind of issue that Itauma's going to have moving forward, isn't it? He's obviously a prodigy. He's obviously tremendously talented. But he doesn't have an enormous following yet. And because of that, the opponents are not going to get big purses. So who wants to go in there with potentially one of the best heavyweights in the world and get chicken change. You know? The names aren't going to want to do that. Wow, Tony S says Franklin lost 3 family members in one night. Did he? What happened there? That sounds terrible. Tony S says, could he have a Buster Douglas moment? That sounds absolutely terrible. 3 family members in one night? Good question from Cobby Barnes. He says, do you think Itauma's recent bicep tear could be a factor? It may be. And this is not the first time that Itauma's been injured in his very short career. He's had a couple of previous injuries. I think there was a hand injury. So if we're looking for potential issues in Itauma, could it be that he's injury prone? Shout out to Craig, Welsh Boxer. He says, just logging in. What's up, everyone? Have I missed much? Now, we've just started, really. We're talking mainly about Itauma Franklin, the weigh-in, the weights for both guys, the expectations on Itauma, and so on. Yeah, but Afro Jam, what the media do is what they do. I'm focusing on where Itauma's actually at, not all the media noise. Yeah, he's potentially one of the best heavyweights in the world from the perspective of potential opponents, right? If we're trying to get big names to fight him, as some people want, well, if they see him as potentially one of the best heavyweights in the world, they're not going to fight him unless they're getting paid big money. But he doesn't have the kind of following which would really make big money realistic. Iron's analysis says, evening Hatman, I think it's very clever matchmaking from Queensbury if he stops him, which I think he will. He'll be the first to stop Franklin. AJ and White couldn't. I think it's a good fight for where he's at. 13-0, taking on a guy never been stopped before, has been a distance with a couple of top 10 guys. One of them a former 2-time world heavyweight champion, coming off back-to-back points. Losses to Alexander Usyk, the second of which he put up a decent effort. Truth Channel says that's the problem at the moment with Moses, high risk, low reward. Exactly that. What is there to gain? You know, that's the way they see it. If they're not making big money. I'm talking about the names in the heavyweight division. So I personally, and I tend to err on the side of caution, but I personally am expecting this fight to go some rounds. It's a 10-rounder. I'm expecting it to go maybe at least 6 or 7 rounds. If Itauma dispatches of Franklin in, let's say, under 4 rounds, to me that's tremendously impressive. Because Franklin is a very, very tough man, and he knows how to survive. He's got that veteran savvy about him, where if he doesn't want to get taken out, it's going to be difficult for most fighters to do so, even most top 10 fighters. So, yeah, if Itauma just blasts through him, for me, that's mightily impressive. This is a guy that doesn't get stopped. So we'll see what happens tomorrow night. I'm very much looking forward to it. To seeing Itauma's progress, to seeing if there's an issue with the leg, to seeing if there's an issue with a bicep, to seeing if the layoff has had any noticeable detrimental effect on his performance level. We shall see. So that's Itauma versus Franklin taking place tomorrow night. So let's move on then. Shout out to everybody joining in the live chat. Just locking in. We've also got this one tomorrow night. Sebastian Fundora defending his junior middleweight or super welterweight, however you guys want to describe it these days, titles against Keith one-time Thurman. In fact, does Fundora still have multiple belts, or has he just got the one now? Let me double check that. Sometimes it's hard to keep up on who's got what belt, how many belts they got. No, Fundora's just got the one belt. He had 2 belts at one point though, didn't he? Now he's just got the WBC, with Virgil Ortiz being the interim champ. Can somebody jog my memory at what happened to Fundora's other belt? Tony S says Fundora has weird biceps. He certainly does. It's barely a bicep there, is there? But the height difference, as you can see, is absolutely crazy. King James calling him Slender Man versus the ghost of Keith Thurman. Seb says he tore one. Okay. Talaman says he had to vacate. Do you remember why he had to vacate? So yeah, there's Sebastian Fundora, who I think is 6'5" or 6'6", 154 pounds. Keith Thurman is about 5'7", maybe 5'7.5" on a good day. And so there's an obvious issue here for Thurman. How's he going to land on the target? And it must be very tiring when Fundora actually uses his height and reach and fights long, as he did in the most recent Tim Tszyu fight. In the first fight, he didn't fight long. But in the second fight, he did. And that makes the shorter guy have to work so much harder to get in range and get his shots off. And on top of that, he's having to punch upwards. And I'm talking about a long way upwards. And that uses more energy. So can Keith Thurman actually tackle this obstacle? Will it be too much for him? In fact, on that very same Ring Magazine show, they were asking whether if Thurman pulls this off, it will be the best win of his career. And a couple of the guys said no, it wouldn't be, because he's already beaten the likes of Danny Garcia and Sean Porter. Personally, I think it would be. I think this represents a much bigger challenge. Even for a prime Thurman, I think this would have been a bigger challenge than beating the likes of Danny Garcia or Sean Porter, just because of the dimensions of Fundora. And the fact that Fundora is in his prime. Can we really say that? Well, we can't say Garcia was in his prime, I don't think, when Thurman beat him. You might argue that Sean Porter was close to his prime, although probably a little bit past it. So I think if Thurman pulls this off, it'll be the best win of his career. But I'm not expecting him to. I'm expecting Fundora to retain his belt. Benjamin says height difference makes Thurman look even more goofy. It is crazy, isn't it? Talaman says Fundora will beat Thurman light work. Afro Jam says Zayas was his mandatory. Are you suggesting he vacated to avoid Zayas? Is that what it was? They're saying apparently Fundora is currently the tallest champion in boxing. I think that's correct, yeah? I think that's correct. Because Usyk's only 6'3". Wardley, actually, no, I think Wardley might be joint tallest. I think Wardley is 6'5". And if Fundora is 6'5" as well, then they're the same height. Coppen says Fundora don't have a jab unless he pulls one out for this fight. Thurman should find an entry point on the inside. I'd have to go back and watch the Tszyu rematch again. But I seem to remember he was controlling things at long range against Zhu. Wasn't he using the jab to do that? Again, I'd have to go back and watch the fight. I've only seen it once. Seb says Fundora is apparently 6'5.5". Okay, so that would make him 0.5 of an inch taller than Fabio Wardley. So maybe he is the tallest champion in boxing by a whisker. Talaman says Fundora is a good inside fighter. I mean, for a tall guy, he's relatively good on the inside, but I don't think it's wise for Fundora to fight on the inside like that. That's what got him chinned against Brian Mendoza. Yeah, he got chinned in that fight. So I think him developing his long-range game and learning to use the height and reach more effectively is the way for him to go. And he showed that in the Zhu rematch. In the first fight, yeah, he was banging it out on the inside. Whereas in the rematch, he used the height and reach better, and it was one-sided. Shout out to Fernie G. He says, I live in Fundora's hometown. Oddly enough, he's not that well known. I'm not surprised by that. There doesn't appear to be the same kind of grassroots support for fighters in the States in this day and age, for boxers, should I say, as there was back in the 70s and 80s. You know, back in the 70s and 80s, in America, people knew who their local boxers were. Even if they weren't at any great level, they were well known in the community throughout the United States. But nowadays, it's just not like that. People don't pay attention to who their local boxers are. Maybe it's an aspect of American exceptionalism. Maybe it's like, well, unless our local boxer is winning world titles, then we won't care about him until then. You know, okay, he's got some amateur pedigree. We don't care about that. Wake us up when he's actually a champion. Then we'll pay attention to the local guy. Is there that kind of attitude in America when it comes to local fighters? Yeah, big up Talaman if everyone can hit the like button. I'd really appreciate it. Tony S says, has anyone seen Sam Jones and Spencer Fearon ranking the greatest heavyweight champions of all time? It was an hour long and really interesting. I haven't seen it. I might go check that out. Big up Av. He says, just got to my hotel in Manny, guys. Ringside seats for this one. Fantastic. Shout out to Lincoln. She says, is Franklin better than the Kevin Johnson AJ beat? That's a really good question. We'll know more after the fight because Kevin Johnson was always very durable. Prior to losing to AJ, had been the distance with so many people. Had been the distance with Vitaly Klitschko, Luke Partridge, loads of other guys. How old was Kevin Johnson when AJ fought him? Let me get that up now. So I want to say provisionally, I don't want to say that Franklin is necessarily better than Kevin Johnson because, you know, Johnson was a decent-ish fighter. He had a very good jab. Johnson might be a better fighter than Franklin all round, right? Prime Kevin Johnson. But it's about who's tougher, who's easier to stop. And that question will be more easily answered after the fight. But I want to say that Franklin might be younger than Johnson was when AJ fought him. I'm just going to double check here on BoxRec. 1 second. That's a good question there. Um, Let me have a look at the age. So, where are we at? Kevin Johnson, who AJ took out in 2 rounds. I mean, he was very close to being a 1-round knockout. Was that the first time that Kevin Johnson was ever dropped in a fight? It might have been. One thing I'll say, though, is that Kevin Johnson didn't get hit flush as much as I've seen Jermaine Franklin get hit flush in fights. And I'm talking about prior to losing to AJ. He was quite defensively slick, Kevin Johnson. He was good at avoiding getting hit real clean with a hard shot. Franklin is relatively defensively cute as well, but we've seen him get hit very clean in the Dillian Whyte fight and also in the AJ fight. He got hit very clean on the chin in both fights. So my suspicion is Franklin's probably got the better chin at this stage of the career than Johnson when he fought AJ. So let me have a look at the bout here. Kevin Johnson, has he got the age? No, he's about the same age, to be fair. So Kevin Johnson was 35 when he fought AJ. And Franklin, I think he's 35 also, or is he 33 or 34? So that's a good question. Let me have a check here. Actually, no, Franklin is 32. So he's 3 years younger than Johnson was when he got knocked out in 2 rounds by AJ. So I would say Kevin Johnson probably a better fighter overall than Franklin, but probably not as durable by the time he fought AJ as Franklin is now. But perhaps I'll change my perspective on that. If Itauma goes out there and ices Franklin in a round, knocks him out cold, then I'll say, well, maybe Franklin's durability is not what it once was. Shout out to Linkage for a very good question. Big up Matt Borgerson for the super chat. He says, I think the most realistic scenario is that not only does Franklin get stopped early like everyone else, we learn nothing about Itauma until the elite. Also, anyone who thinks is picking Keith Thurman to win is lying to themselves or just Sean Porter viewers because Porter has the most wacky takes, or most whack takes, excuse me. Shout out to Matt. He says, is Franklin wins Porter is David thrice? Okay, I didn't quite comprehend the last one from Matt. If you can clarify that last super chat, much appreciated. But yeah, the one about Itauma, we won't learn anything about him until he fights the elite. A lot of people are saying that. A lot of people think that Itauma is so good, at least up to a certain level, that there's nobody other than the genuine, legit top 5, top 10 guys that are actually going to be able to ask any questions of him in the ring. All of these, like, fringe contenders and stuff like that, tough journeymen, the Franklins of the world, they're not going to be able to test him. And so none of these guys, in the view of many people, including many people in the boxing industry, is that it's only when he steps up to close to championship level that we'll get to find out what his chin's like, what his stamina's like, what his heart's like. Whether he can make adjustments during a fight when things get tough. So yeah, many people are of that view, and we shall see. We got Matt Borgerson for the super chat. Atavistic Intellect says, Hatman, who do you think will be a good test, a good chin test for Itauma after this fight? I don't think Franklin has the power to truly test his chin. Well, to be honest, you don't really want a fighter's chin to get tested until... I guess it depends what perspective you're looking from. From a managerial perspective, yeah, you don't want their fighter's chin to get tested. If they get hit, they get hit. If you fight a puncher, it's done out of necessity, not because you want to pursue a puncher or a fight against the puncher. From a fan perspective, just out of curiosity, who could test Itauma's chin? Well, there are so many guys in the top 10. I mean, Zhang, potentially. Bakoli can hit pretty hard. You got guys out there like Jalalov, obviously a fantastic amateur with dynamite power. I mean, there's so many guys out there, right? In fact, let's get the rankings up on the screen here. And this is, you'll notice that Hergovic's name is highlighted, and that's because that's the next topic I want to cover here, is the Hergovic-Dave Allen fight, which has now been officially announced. So just ignore the Hergovic highlight, but you've got the likes of Jalalov, who I've just mentioned, Richard Riakpork can punch, Martin Bakole, F.A. Jagba, he can crack. Lawrence Okoli can crack. He's obviously shared a lot of rounds with Itauma in sparring back in the days. Zheli Zhang, obviously, he's a very big puncher. Who else we got here? Richard Torres, decent puncher. Anthony Joshua, Daniel Dubois. Fabio Ward is obviously a belt holder. There's a lot of guys out there who could potentially test Itauma's chin and let us know whether he can take a shot or not. But I'm not sure they would want to pursue that. I don't think any boxing team would think that way. Like, we need our guy's chin tested. Let's put him in against the puncher. I mean, some guys might, particularly a promoter who's really unsure about a fighter. But in this case, I don't think they'll be looking to do that. I think they'll be looking to put him in against somebody next. If he blows through Franklin, they'll be looking to put him in against somebody next who has a better track record than Franklin, a bigger name, hopefully more durable, because you do need a young fighter like this to get rounds. You do. And so for me, it'll be the same answer as I gave after he knocked out Dylan White in a round, and that is to put him in against Filip Hergovic. Because Hergovic is a very tough guy. He's fought at a high level. He's never challenged for the heavyweight title yet, but he's fought championship level fighters. He fought, obviously, Daniel Dubois. He fought Joe Joyce, who was interim champion at one point, etc., etc. So I think Hergovic would be the obvious next step for Itauma, because, again, this is all dependent on how he performs against Franklin, and if he wipes Franklin out, then that's what I would go with, Filip Hergovic. If Filip Hergovic doesn't have any issues and doesn't have any opportunities, and if he's available, then yeah, they could look at that. But he's going to want a ton of money. I think the reason that that fight wasn't the next fight for Itauma, and instead it's Franklin, is because Hergovic would have wanted a king's ransom to fight Itauma. Like, why are you going to fight a 13-0 prospect unless you're being paid a lot? Where's the upside for you? You know? So I can't necessarily blame Hergovic over that. Shout out to Matt Borges. He says, oh, okay, I see what he says. Matt says, if Itauma loses by KO, we call him David Thrice. That'd be crazy because, look, stranger things have happened in boxing, but Jermaine Franklin is not a prolific puncher, is he? I mean, if he catches you right with 56 pounds behind a right hand, I'm sure it's not going to tickle. But he doesn't have a knack of landing really hurtful power shots, does he? I mean, AJ, coming off the 2 Usyk defeats, he got hit flushed by a Franklin right hand several times and nothing happened. It literally bounced off AJ's chin, didn't get any kind of reaction. AJ didn't wobble or anything. So, you know, Franklin doesn't have a good track record of being a really hurtful puncher. So if he was to go in there and seriously hurt or chin Itauma, that would be a big concern, obviously, right? Big up Matt Borgerson for the super chat. Matt also says, Torres or Jared Anderson next up. Excuse me, Torres or Jared Anderson next is a good step up. Yeah, I'm skeptical about either of those fights happening in the near future because Torres is still, last I checked, top-ranked property. So are they really going to want to match him before he's had a title shot against someone like Itauma? I know Torres called Itauma out, but that's just him. You know, I don't think that Bob Arum would be particularly keen on putting that fight together. To put it in perspective, Bob Arum wasn't very keen on Jared Anderson fighting Martin Bakole, and he basically said that Turki Al Sheikh went behind his back or over his head, or however you want to describe it, and talked directly to the fighter. And he was the one that made Anderson an offer he couldn't refuse because the money was just too good. And Anderson disregarded Bob Arum's advice and took that fight. Does Bob Arum want the same thing to happen with Richard Torres? I seriously doubt it. But then again, here's me kind of pushing back against my own point. How many shows have Top Rank got as part of their DAZN deal? I don't think it's an enormous number of shows, is it? So that might mean that Top Rank are more willing to actually take risks with some of their young unbeaten fighters if they don't have a tremendous amount of shows. You know, there might be some pressure from DAZN for them to take more risks. But yeah, I'll be surprised if Torres or Anderson were put in against Itauma anytime soon. Unless Itauma looks really bad against Franklin, it would surprise me. If either of them, Torres or Anderson, were to be put forward as an Itauma opponent, I would assume it would be Anderson because he's already lost. So there isn't the possibility anymore to preserve a O for marketing purposes. And that'd be a good fight against Torres or Anderson for Itauma. Be interesting, be entertaining. Fights between young heavyweights usually are entertaining, especially if they're young athletic heavyweights. So big up Matt for the super chat. Big up Matt, he says, Jared Anderson at the small room at MSG for his pro debut by Queensbury is obviously the next fight. It makes the most sense in the world right now. Well, we can talk about his next fight because it's been officially announced now. Jared Anderson will not fight at the small room in MSG for his Queensbury debut. Instead, he will fight on the undercard in the UK, obviously, of Fabio Wardley versus Daniel Dubois. If you look at the chief support, it's Jared Anderson versus Sol Dakers. That will be Jared Anderson's next fight. No, not co-main, but chief support. Yeah. That is now official. He has signed a co-promotional deal with Queensbury. He's still with Top Rank, but also has Queensbury as part of his promotional setup. And again, presumably this is because Top Rank have got a limited number of dates with DAZN at the moment. So signing a co-promotional deal makes sense. It means he can get out on Queensbury shows who have a lot more dates than Top Rank have. So yeah. Matt says the main event and Esserman is a good scrap. Tony S says, I think they may do Anderson versus David Adelaide after Dakers. And in fact, Adelaide might be a good fight for Itauma if he gets past Franklin. That's a decent fight right there. If Adelaide was shown the right money, he might do it. I think Adelaide is a tough guy. I don't think he's any kind of cupcake. He may be limited, but I think he's a tough guy. Activistic Intellect says, what do you think of Miller for Itauma next? Let's see how Miller gets on in his next fight against Pero. The Miller who fought Kingsley eBay would probably get stopped by Itauma. But Miller at the best he can be, I mean, he's 37 now, Jarrell Miller. If he can somehow replicate the kind of form we've seen from him in some previous fights, Miller's a tough fight for anyone, to be honest. because he puts so much pressure on you and he's got an iron jaw. He's not the biggest puncher in the world, but he's so physically strong and he's got such a good chin and he forces you to work so hard. He isn't the most sophisticated fighter in the world, but with the attributes he has, he can make it difficult for damn near anyone when he's at his best. So that would be a stern test, I think, if Miller, again, is anywhere close to top form. That'd be a stern test for Itauma. If Itauma was able to stop Miller or just get past Miller without too many problems, that'd be impressive. Yep, I think Guido Vianello is also a good shout, a very good shout, Matt Borgerson. Some people have mentioned that previously. Yes, Guido Vianello would be a good opponent. Vianello's game, he's tough. Never been stopped. Don't think he's ever been down. Had a good amateur background. I think if they can't get Hergovic, Vianello would be the next best choice for that type of opponent. You know, a tall, game guy that throws a lot of shots. Although with Vianello, he was soundly outpointed by Richard Torres. So there would kind of be pressure on Itauma to do a better job than Torres. Guzzi says Miller won't take the fight unless he gets paid. And therein lies the problem again, which we've been reiterating over the past few minutes. Itauma is not at the stage yet where he's got a massive fan base, and that means anyone who is offered a fight with him that's a big name, that's an established heavyweight, is going to want a crazy amount of money. And unless Frank Warren's willing to take a massive hit on the show and he no longer has Saudi money behind him, unless he is willing to make a, take a massive loss, paying an opponent, named opponent against Itauma, then it's going to be difficult. Indeed, Andy Ruiz would want paying a king's ransom. And Andy Ruiz, I think, is now with Zuffa. That's the rumor anyway. I'm not sure if that's official, but the rumor is Andy Ruiz is now with Zuffa Boxing. And Zuffa and Frank Warren have got a problem. So I don't know if that would be a realistic fight right now for Moses Itauma. I suspect it wouldn't be. Shout out to Matt. He says, we haven't heard a peep from the Saudis since blank in blank, if you know what I mean. Where are the Saudis at? Well, the Saudis are still putting on shows. They announced the other day that Matchroom, Eddie Hearn, are extending their deal with Riyadh Season. Or was it Ring Magazine? One of the Saudi outfits, anyway, that put on shows. One of the Saudi promotional or events entities. It's either Riyadh Season or Ring Magazine that Matchroom are extending their deal with. That was announced just the other day. So they're still going to be putting on shows, but presumably they won't be in Saudi. They'll be in the States or in the UK. Matt Borgerson says, Zuffa is becoming the BKFC of boxing, the place where washed up fighters go to die. Yeah, somebody mentioned the other day that BKFC have signed a bunch of these old fighters who I thought were retired. Can somebody jog my memory in terms of the fighters that BKFC have just signed? It's a load of like very, very old very old former contenders and champions in boxing. I forget some of the names. I was like, wow, that guy's going to be in BKFC. Some of these guys have been retired from boxing for a while. Yeah, I'm aware of Jamel Herring and Austin Trout, but there was some other guys very recently, like over the past week, who've just announced they're going to be in BKFC. Some well-known names in boxing from back in the days. Gamboa, yeah, that's one of them. Yuriorkis Gamboa. Yuriorkis Gamboa is going to be doing BKFC. Like, what the hell? I don't like that for Gamboa, to be honest, because he was a good fighter back in the days, Gamboa, but he was always chinny. And now he's going to be getting hit with bare knuckles. Victor Ortiz, that's the other one. Thank you. Thank you, Yems Talks Boxing. So it's Gamboa and Ortiz. We've got two former world champions now in Gamboa and Ortiz. And Ortiz has been retired, hasn't he, for years? Hasn't Gamboa been retired for years as well? Or has he been fighting in obscurity? And that's why I'm assuming he's been retired for years. Wow, Dorticos is in BK. Now, Dorticos could be a pro. I completely agree with Gaz. Dorticus, or Dorticus, however you want to pronounce it. Dorticus could be a problem in BKFC. Because that guy's tough as nails. And he's aggressive. And you know BKFC, they've got fewer rounds. The fights are shorter. Yeah, Dorticus, he could be a problem. Like, for real, for real. He's a tough, tough guy. And he can punch, and he's aggressive. Franny G says those BKFC fights are quite entertaining. For those who don't know, BKFC is bare knuckle boxing. Anyway, let's move on from this then. We've got a few other things to talk about here. So let's start with the now official Dave Allen versus Filip Hergovic fight, which is topping the bill at the Eco Power Stadium in Doncaster. Imagine Filip Hergovic fighting in Doncaster. How weird is that? It's a Queensbury show, because we'd heard that the rumor it was going to be Dave Allen fighting at a Queensbury show rather than Matchroom. So top of the bill on the Queensbury show in Doncaster, Saturday, May 16th. What a weird fight. It's a weird fight, particularly for Hergovic. I mean, it's just a stay busy fight for him. Why it's so weird is the fact he's fighting in Doncaster. That's very, very strange. For Dave Allen, it's a payday. Dave Allen had much more chance of beating Makhmudov than he has of beating Hergovic. Dave Allen, in my estimation, had a better chance of beating Zhilei Zhang than he has of beating Hergovic. And that's despite the fact that Zhang is legitimately a bigger puncher, much bigger puncher than Hergovic. But Zhang's only good for about 2-3 rounds at this stage. He's got the worst gas tank in the heavyweight division by a mile. So all Allen had to do, or would have had to do, would be survive, let's say, the first 4 rounds against Zhang. And even if he lost the fight thereafter, he had the potential to be more competitive because Zhang just doesn't throw anything. Whereas with Filip Hergovic, he has amongst the highest output of any heavyweight at the moment. And under Abel Sanchez, training up there in Big Bear, he's really improved his stamina. I don't think Hergovic ever had bad stamina. He did gas out in a couple of fights, but not because the stamina was bad. He just didn't pace himself very well. He would come out in the early rounds like he did against Dubois and throw a ridiculous amount of punches for a heavyweight, thinking that he was just going to blast the opponent out in a round or two, punch himself out, and then be huffing and puffing for the remainder of the contest. Well, he still kind of fought a little bit like that against Itauma, although it wasn't as ridiculous with the volume in the early rounds. But because of that altitude training with Abel Sanchez, he's able to maintain the work rate. And for those who didn't see this in the live stream I did a few days ago, I put up some CompuBox figures, okay, just to put things in perspective, because there are going to be some people saying, Hergovic, he doesn't have a great work rate. Oh, yes, he does. So the Hergovic-Joyce fight and the Hergovic-Itauma fight were both 10-rounders, and they went the distance. Hergovic threw over 500 punches in both those fights. That is more punches than Alexander Usyk threw in 12 rounds against Luke Partridge, both times. Luke Partridge, aka Tyson Fury. Let me repeat that. Hergovic threw more punches in 10 rounds versus Atalay and Joyce than Usyk threw in both of the Luke Partridge fights. And it might be the case that he also outthrew Usyk in the 2 AJ fights as well, although I haven't checked that, so don't quote me. But Hergovic throws a lot of punches. In fact, there was only maybe 10 or so punches over the course of 10 rounds difference between Hergovic and Joyce. And we know Joyce throws a lot. Hergovic was only a couple of punches behind him in terms of output. So he throws an awful lot of shots. He's got an iron jaw. He's actually quite skilled at landing his punches, Hergovic. I think he's underrated in terms of his offensive creativity and his accuracy. Going in there against the Dave Allen, who is easy to hit, who's got an iron jaw himself, but who's extremely crude. I just don't see anything in this fight other than Dave Allen being used as a human heavy bag. the one, see, some people were talking about body shots. If Allen can land body shots on Hergovic, I just don't think Allen throws enough punches to be able to make body shots or even headshots a factor in the fight. I think the best hope for Allen here is that Hergovic's extremely alpha personality causes extreme underestimation of Dave Allen and maybe a lack of motivation going into the fight. Maybe Hergovic doesn't even go to Big Bear, doesn't train properly. Then maybe Allen might have some kind of chance. That's what you'd have to be hoping for. Because if it's not that, then this will be far more one-sided than the Makhmudov fight was, with Dave Allen just taking an absolute pasting. Honestly. Again, Hergovic is not a massive puncher. He's got average power. He doesn't hit as hard as Makhmudov. He will not be anywhere close to the hardest puncher that Dave Allen's been in with. But Frazer Clarke, as I said earlier on, not a massive puncher. He forced Dave Allen to quit. Tony Yoka, according to Allen, was the hardest puncher he'd been in the ring with, but you wonder about that because Yoka doesn't appear to be, you know, as an outsider looking in, one of the biggest punchers in the heavyweight division. He's certainly not one of the most prolific. And he managed to deal with Dave Allen. So, yeah, Filip Hergovic, I think, will ping Dave Allen around. And it will be horrific for Allen in terms of his health. I just hope he comes out okay on the night. But in the long run, all them brain cells that Dave Allen is losing, he's literally trading in his brain cells for money. Shout out to Lone Wolf Boxing. He says, big up Hatman, where do you see Hergovic's career going after the Allen fight? I feel it has stagnated. Also, Miller versus Hutchinson. Who have you got? Miller versus Hutchinson. I guess you meant Taylor versus Hutchinson. So, the problem for a lot of heavyweights right now is that Usyk is holding the belts hostage. I never imagined myself ever saying this because Usyk up to this point has been an exemplary champion. But he's obviously had rematches and all of that has held the division up. Think about it. The rematches with AJ, Partridge, and Dubois have meant that lots of other heavyweight contenders, mandatories, etc., have been frozen out of the heavyweight title picture for years now. This is why I've not only got an issue with Usyk fighting this Rico Verhoeven kickboxer guy, but I've also got an issue with all these immediate rematches in boxing. I mean, the Dubois rematch wasn't immediate, to be fair, but the Partridge and the AJ fights were immediate rematches. And yeah, there's too many of those in the heavyweight division. It's holding the division up and it's stagnating the careers of people like Hergovic. Because if it weren't for that, then Hergovic probably would have fought for the title by now. Several other heavyweights probably would have fought for the title by now. So I don't think it's all of Hergovic's making, because ultimately all of these contenders, the main goal is to fight for the heavyweight championship. Yeah, that's why they Obviously, they have some fights in the meantime, but ultimately they're trying to some extent, hold out until they get their title shot. And I can't even blame them. I can't blame them. Because boxing is high stakes. It's like snakes and ladders. If you lose one fight, especially if you lose it badly, you're all the way back down to the bottom of the ladder, and you might miss out. I mean, a great example of what I'm talking about is when Joe Joyce was WBO interim champion. Rather than wait for his title shot, he fought Zheli Zhang and he got himself chinned twice. And now everybody looks back and says, that was a terrible fight for Joe Joyce to take. But at the time we were applauding him, although I said at the time, yeah, it's a great fight from a stylistic perspective. It's interesting for the fans. But I wouldn't have begrudged Joe Joyce at all if he didn't fight Zhang, if he just sat on his position and waited for the mandatory to be called. I wouldn't have begrudged him at all, because he earned that shot by beating Joseph Parker. So I wouldn't have expected any more of him than just sitting it out and getting that title shot called. Maybe fighting a few warm-ups, stay busy fights in the meantime. So yeah, I can't say that Hergovic's career, being as stagnant as it is all his fault. I can't say that. He did fight Daniel Dubois, obviously. He came back since then, and he's been, he fought Joe Joyce. So, yeah, that's what I'll say about Filip Hergovic's career. Now, as far as Willie Hutchinson versus Ezra Taylor, I've got Willie Hutchinson winning the fight. The thing, though, that's making me think Ezra Taylor might have a better chance of winning than I'm giving him credit for, obviously, Hutchinson was stopped earlier on in his career, and he did get beat by Joshua Buatsi. He was down several times in that fight. Or he was down at least once. He was hurt several times. Actually, was Willie Hutchinson down? I think he was. But he hung tough and he managed to come through. I don't know how physically strong Hutchinson is. He's skilled. I think he's a decent puncher. But I've got question marks about his physical strength, because Buatsi really bullied him. Whenever Buatsi got close to him, he kind of ragdolled Willie Hutchinson. And Buatsi's a strong guy, but he wasn't able to ragdoll Callum Smith, was he? Which just puts things in perspective. Does Ezra Taylor have a significant physical strength advantage over Willie Hutchinson? If he does, and he can actually impose that in the fight, then maybe he's got an edge, But in terms of the skills, I think Willie Hutchinson is a much more skilled, much more talented fighter. But sometimes physicality can actually trump talent if the physicality is applied the right way and if the advantage in physicality is significant enough. So that's what I'll say about it. But yeah, anyway, my pick would be appreciated for the super chat. Tony Yes says Ezra looks in phenomenal shape. Vengeance says, yes, he was dropped with a left hook by Buatsi. The Reality Filter says, Hergovic's best win is a 40-year-old ghost of Joyce. No, well, you could say the Zhang win was better. That was pretty much a prime Zhang, or the best version of Zhang we've seen, if you don't want to call him prime, because he was pretty old himself at that stage, but that was pre-Joyce Zhang. So that was Hergovic's best win. And some people say Zhang got robbed. He didn't get robbed. If you actually go back and watch that fight, which is on YouTube, it's a very close fight. If you say that you thought Zhang shaded it, I wouldn't argue. But you could just as easily argue that Hergovic shaded it. It was a very close fight. If you look at the CompuBox stats, they even will show you that it was a close fight. Obviously, CompuBox doesn't tell the full story in terms of the quality of punches. But it gives you a rough impression of how a fight looked. Yep, Ryan Emer says the likes of Joyce, Zhang, Hergovic, Piccoli, Parker all should have got title shots, but they had to wait too long, so they all decided to take risks. And it put them out of the picture. I mean, that's a great example right there. This is what they're risking by fighting each other. These guys had all worked their way to a position where they were either #1 contenders or mandatories or close to. And rather than waiting it out and just having stay busy fights, they decided to fight each other for good purses, and it backfired. Again, the best example being when Joyce decided to fight Zhang. That backfired in spectacular fashion. The reality filter says Hergovic has done nothing to deserve a title shot. Has Rico Verhoeven done anything to deserve a title shot? So, I think Hergovic is a legitimate top 10 guy, and you could easily, incredibly defend against him in a voluntary. So, if you're a legit top 10 guy, then there's no issue with you getting an opportunity as a voluntary defense for a champion. In other words, you deserve a title shot. Hergovic hasn't fought his way into the mandatory position. Yeah, he hasn't done that. But then your argument would be, well, nobody deserves a title shot unless they're mandatory. I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. Reality Filter says Rico went unbeaten in kickboxing at championship level for 10 years. What's that got to do with boxing? That's got zero to do with boxing. He's had one professional boxing match. What was it, a decade ago? It's got nothing to do with boxing. Totally irrelevant. Matt says these promoters freaking suck at advertising fighters now. Rico is more known than most pro boxers because boxing promoters literally suck at promoting worse than the UFC. Is he well known? I had never heard of the guy before. Maybe in the States, because boxing promoters in the States are doing a terrible job. I agree with that. But in the UK, boxing promoters are doing a great job. Yeah? UFC do a great job promoting not only in America, but also in the UK and around the world. So when Luke Partridge fought Ngannou, I knew exactly who Ngannou was, but Rico Verhoeven, never heard of him before in my life until this fight was made. Never heard of him. Matt also says boxing did this to themselves. Make your heavyweights more known to the public. Then maybe Rico versus Usyk wouldn't happen. But again, in the UK, Usyk is far more well-known than Rico. Far more well-known. I don't know about on the continent, on the European continent, I don't know. In the UK, it's not even close. I mean, Usyk just many, 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 many times more famous than Rico. Some people are asking my thoughts, Activistic Intellect being one of them, on Jalalov wasting his talent. Yeah, it's a very, very strange case, isn't it? You know, when they talk about the curious case of this person or curious case of that person, the curious case of Bakidir Jalalov, what is that guy up to? I've been asked this question many times, and I really can't give you an answer, folks. I'm just as baffled as you are. Here we have a guy who's like coming out of the amateurs where he was totally dominant. Gold medals all over the place. Two-time Olympic champion, etc., etc. But there's this hesitance from him to let go of the amateur code and fully commit himself to a professional career. I have no idea what that's all about. Is there a lack of belief there? Does he not think he can transition to the pro game successfully? And so he wants to try and make as much money as he can out of amateur boxing? Because as I understand it, in his country, Uzbekistan, the government, from what I heard, are paying him quite a lot of money to keep going into the Olympics. And maybe he's thinking, you know what? I don't fancy doing these 10-rounders and 12-rounders. Let me just milk as much as I can out of the amateur career. Again, 2 million plus followers on Insta. Compare that to boxers, it's nothing. And I can assure you, Reality Filter, Rico is not known to the general public in the UK. I can 100% assure you of that. It's not just me. Alexander Usyk is massively more famous in the UK than Rico. I can assure you of that. I don't know where you live or where you're from and all the kickboxing stuff. Kickboxing is not a big sport in the UK. People don't watch kickboxing in Britain like that. In terms of combat sports, boxing is the #1 combat sport in Britain, followed by MMA. Kickboxing is not a big thing in the UK. People don't really watch it, don't know about it. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. And of course, the UK is one of the epicenters of boxing today. One of the biggest markets for boxing is the United Kingdom. So all of that Rico stuff, that must be on the continent somewhere. In Britain, I can assure you, most people have got no idea who Rico is. Shout out to Matt Borgerson for the super chat. He says, Jalolov has a name nobody can remember, pronounce, and is from a part of the world people hate in today's geopolitical landscape. Unmarketable. Do people hate Uzbekistan? Wasn't aware of that. Jalolov, last I checked, was promoted by Top Rank. Obviously, there are challenges there from a marketing perspective, but I don't think they're insurmountable challenges for a guy like Jalolov who can punch, who's got all the pedigree. He just needs to fully commit himself to pro boxing. I think that's the main problem. I'm not saying that the points you just raised are not valid. They are valid. But I think a much bigger issue than any of those points is the fact that Jalolov has still got one foot in amateur boxing. He has to come out of amateur boxing completely and commit himself to pro boxing. And I think he'll become a factor if he does that. Let's just put it that way. Although his last performance, he fought some, I think it was a Russian guy who really tested him and made him look uncomfortable in there. I forget the guy's name now. Craig Welsh Boxer, big up. He said, I never heard of this Rico guy until the Usyk fight was signed. Me neither. And you'll find that in the UK, it's like that for most people. We've got no idea who this Rico guy is. Kickboxing in Britain is a super niche sport. Yeah, most people in Britain do not follow kickboxing. It's very, very niche. Kickboxing is more of a thing on the European continent. Yeah, France, Belgium, and Holland, and those places, that's where they follow kickboxing. But in the UK, nah, bro. The UK is not a kickboxing nation. Fernie G says, every fight in the UK feels like a huge event. Ryan Nemus says the same thing. He's from the UK. No idea who Rico is. Reality Filter, you're obviously somebody that's into the niche sport of kickboxing then, because as you can tell from most of the comments from other people in the chat, all boxing fans, they're saying the same thing as me. No idea who Rico was before he signed to fight Usyk. No idea. Never seen the guy, never heard of him, nothing. So I guess you're living in that bubble of the kickboxing thinking that it's representative of the general public in Britain. It isn't. Most people in Britain have no idea who Rico is. Certainly most boxing fans in Britain have no idea who Rico is. No, he's not huge in Britain. You keep saying he's huge, maybe in the little kickboxing niche community in Britain, but among the general population in Britain, no one has any idea who he is. Waved says the same thing. Just look at the comments. Look at the comments, Reality Filter. Look at the comment. Yeah, I know Tom Aspinall because he's a UFC fighter. UFC is big in Britain. Kickboxing is not. Yeah. I already mentioned that. The biggest combat sport in Britain is boxing by an absolute country mile, and then MMA below that. So yes, I knew who Ngannou was when he fought Fury. Again, reality filter, you're making an irrelevant point. Aspinall's been training with Rico for 10 years. That's irrelevant. What's that got to do with the price of cheese? Aspinall is UFC heavyweight champion. UFC is a massive brand, and that is why I know they're heavyweight champion. Aspinall training with Rico doesn't mean anything. Aspinall's UFC heavyweight champion. That's why I know him. Because MMA is a much bigger sport in Britain than kickboxing is. For all intents and purposes, nobody follows kickboxing in Britain, bro. You're one of the small, niche kickboxing followers in Britain. Because most people have no interest in kickboxing. I'd agree with Waved. I think certainly among boxing fans, Dave Allen is more well known than Rico among like British boxing fans. Yeah, nobody knows Rico. Ain't nobody following that guy in Britain. He might have however many millions of followers, but I tell you what, the majority of them are not from Britain. They're from Europe or wherever the case may be where they follow that sport. Anyway, let's move on from Dave Allen and all this other Rico talk and touch on this here. Jai Opetaia once again being stripped of the IBF Cruiserweight title, paving the way for a potential all-British world title fight. And who is that, you may ask? It's a potential fight between Vidal Riley, if he gets past Masternak on the Wilder Chisora undercard, and CBS Chris Willem-Smith, because the IBF title is now vacant. And I think they fought in the amateurs, didn't they? Vidal Riley and CBS, and I think Vidal Riley won. So it could be a rematch from their amateur contest. Now, I'm going to echo the sentiments of most people regarding Jai Opetaia here. He's done this to himself by signing with Zuffa. Zuffa made no secret of the fact that they didn't have any respect for the established existing sanctioning bodies. So if you are really dead set on Undisputed, the worst people to sign with would be Zuffa Boxing. And that's who Jai Opetaia signed with. I can understand his frustration, which led him to sign with Zuffa as far as purses, because he was making chicken change for the past few fights when he was with Matchroom, or still associated with Matchroom. He might have not actually had a long-term contract with them, but he was still associated with them. And he was fighting in Australia the past couple times. He made chicken change. The purses he's been getting, or the purse he got for the Glanton fight, was several times higher than the purses he's been getting for his last few fights in Australia. So the financial aspect, I understand the frustration. And I understand the frustration as far as the unifications. But signing with Zuffa was never going to make the situation better, was it? I've said this before about Opetaia. He's clearly a born fighter. But judging by this move and his reaction to this move, he's not a born businessman, is he? Certainly not in terms of boxing business. He might be good at other types of business, possibly, but when it comes to the boxing business, he seems a bit naive to me. It was a naive move signing with Zuffa, thinking that that would bring you closer to Undisputed. In fact, it's ensured that he's further away than ever. So, do I have sympathy for Opetaia? It's hard to have sympathy for him, do you know what I mean? Because here we are as boxing fans, we are not privy to the contracts. We're not boxing insiders, most of us. But we could tell easily that this was likely to happen. And if those of us on the outside could see that this was a likely scenario, how could he not see it? That's why people have got such little sympathy for him. Like, come on, bro. Everyone could tell that this was going to take you further away from Undisputed. Like, what are you doing? So, a very strange move from Opetaia, and now he's upset and disappointed and all this kind of thing. I mean, how he didn't see it coming, I've got no idea. Craig Welsh Boxer says his team come across as a bit incompetent. Either incompetent or they don't really have his best interests at heart. At the end of the day, his manager is going to take a cut of his purses, whatever his purses are. If his manager doesn't think that he can get Undisputed with Eddie Hearn or any other boxing promoter, or Undisputed with Zuffa, like privately, then he's just going to get Jai to sign with whoever's paying the most money. He's not necessarily going to care about whether it takes them further away from Undisputed. Do you know what I mean? Because maybe he doesn't think Undisputed can be made irrespective of which promoter they sign with. And in fact, if you saw the recent interview with Opetaia's, is it manager or promoter? I forget the guy's name now, an Australian guy. He said he likes what Zuffa are doing with the one belt. So he didn't seem particularly, put off by the one belt policy and the UFC style model that they're trying to implement. So yeah, it could be incompetence, Craig, but it could also be something a little more sinister by Opetaia's team. Shout out to D-Man for the super chat. He says, big up Hatman. I don't think Dana will be able to recreate the UFC model like he thinks. He seems to be a bit egotistical as well. Also, just rewatching the Anthony Bourdain Iran episode recommended. I'll have to check that out. Big up D-Man for the recommendation. And I suspect you're right. Because what you're seeing now with the boxing promoters is they're basically closing ranks. They are tying their fighters down to these long-term contracts. All of the other boxing promoters are now, other than Al Heyman, on DAZN, whereas Zuffa are on Paramount and on Sky. So it's going to be a very, very difficult thing for Paramount Zuffa to stop prizing these fighters away from the Frank Warrens and the Eddie Hearns, the Oscar De La Hoyas, and so on. It's going to be very difficult. Maybe if they throw enough money at some of them, they'll be able to do it. But again, you've got long-term contracts there. So irrespective of how much money they offer, unless they're literally going to buy people out of their contracts, will Turkey El Sheep be willing to do that? And as other people have rightly asked, will the situation that's going on right now in the Middle East affect the amount of money the Saudis are spending on boxing? Potentially it will. I mean, they were winding down their spending even before this conflict began. So maybe they're going to wind it down even further the longer the conflict drags on. They got to redirect a lot of their spending towards defense and other things now. So yeah, it's an interesting scenario. I suspect you're correct and that they will not be able to virtually, I mean, they haven't monopolized MMA, but it's effectively a monopoly in terms of the heavy hitters in MMA, I don't think they'll be able to do that in boxing. And if they do manage to do it, it's going to take an awful long time. I mean, many years if they're going to be able to do something like that in an established sport like boxing, which is much bigger than MMA. In UFC, you got, 1,000 fighters. Is it less than that? It fluctuates in terms of the number of fighters they got on their roster. At the maximum, maybe 2,000, but I don't think it's even that high right now. In professional boxing, just male boxing, you got 24,000 active male fighters. Okay, so it's just totally different. Big up D-Man for the super chat. Much appreciated, my guy. Wow. Activistic Intellect says, Hatman, do you know that the UFC has stopped paying fighters travel expenses, hotels, and flights? That's how foul these guys are, man. They're cutting their fighters' expenses even more. Well, presumably they're doing that because they've been forced to actually increase the purses, because they've been getting sued. There's a lot of bad publicity for the UFC right now. They've got loads of current UFC fighters as well as former fighters speaking out against them. And so, in response to that pressure, they have increased some purses for some fighters. But while they operate like government, many governments, where they'll increase spending in one sector and then they quietly cut spending in another sector. Stealth taxes and stuff like that. And yeah, you could see this as like a stealth tax. They're increasing purses to some extent, but then they're not paying for all of this other stuff, which they used to pay for. In Circle says, for every dollar spent on MMA, 95 cents of it is on the UFC, so it's basically a monopoly. So yeah, that's Opetaia anyway, stripped by the IBF, further away than ever from Undisputed. And again, the curious thing with Opetaia is his apparent hesitance to move up to heavyweight. I'm really not sure what that's all about. But even before he signed with Zufar, I was saying that he ain't going to get this Undisputed fight, unfortunately. These other cruiserweights just don't want to fight him. It's frustrating. I can completely understand his frustration, but you have to deal with the situation at hand. You have to deal with what's in front of you. And what's in front of him is he's been frozen out of the Undisputed picture. And that's not going to change anytime soon, no matter who he signs with. Better to move up to heavyweight now, while he's still relatively young and fresh, than wait too long to where he starts to slow down and he's got more miles on the clock. Then there'll be less chance of him actually making an impact at heavyweight. Because Jai Opetaia doesn't have the technique of an Usyk. He's far more reliant on his athleticism. And that fades once you reach into your 30s, generally. It starts to fade. Shout out to Matt for the super chat. He says, why has nobody called out Max Kellerman yet? It would make me so damn happy to hear someone call that shill sellout out. He's my Luke. Well, some people have called him out, actually. Some people have called him out. Max Kellerman, for those who don't realize, is actually quite a disliked figure within the boxing industry. There's a lot of other journalists who don't like him. Adeola Depot has barely hidden, and various other people in the boxing industry. So Kellerman is, even Steve Bunce back in the days had his quite well-publicized issues with Max Kellerman. A lot of people don't like him because he is apparently a very arrogant guy. And in some of the interviews I've seen with him, of like those YouTube interview channels, he has come across in some of them when he's been at shows as extremely arrogant, like surprisingly arrogant, because when he's doing his broadcast, he doesn't come across like that. But when you see him behind the scenes, the way he talks to people or interacts with people, he does come across as like an extremely arrogant guy. So no, he has been getting called out by certain people within the industry, certain fighters, and other people have been calling Kellerman out. Vengeance says, has anyone seen Kellerman rapping? Yep, that's a classic old Kellerman clip when he used to rap. Well, actually, I'm going to, can I say, play devil's advocate? I don't actually mind Kellerman's analysis and his analogies and all that kind of business. So, for example, he was heavily criticized for saying that somebody had Roy Jones-esque style or a style that was patterned on Roy Jones. And then there's the thing about the Larry Holmes jab. Yeah, I don't think he was saying that the guy had a jab as good as Larry Holmes or the guy was as good as Roy Jones. I think what he was saying is that the thinking behind those punches or behind a particular style was Larry Holmes-esque, right? Trying to emulate what Larry Holmes does. Not that it's as good as a Larry Holmes jab, but that's what the guy's going for, you know? So I think he was a little misunderstood when he made some of those comments, to be fair. Where I can criticize Max Kellerman is when, after Opetaia's last fight, he interviewed him in the ring, and he said, "You already are undisputed, Jai. You just don't know it yet." That was a blatant sales pitch or propaganda pitch, if I can call it that, by Kellerman on behalf of Zuffa. I mean, it was blatant because he's trying to push the narrative, as they've been pushing in UFC for years, that once you have this belt, you're undisputed, because UFC champions are referred to by the UFC commentators as undisputed. Well, hang on. How can you be undisputed when there are other belts in MMA? It doesn't make sense. And how can you be undisputed holding the Zuffa belt in boxing when there are other belts? So, yeah, that is something I can definitely criticize Max Kellerman for, because it's ridiculous. Yeah? If you're undisputed, it means you got the 4 belts. Zuffa is just now a 5th belt. In fact, there are many other belts than just the main 4 in boxing, but those are the ones that are these days seen as credible. Zuffa isn't even seen as credible yet. So the idea that you get hold of that belt and you can disregard the other 4, give it a rest. And that's what Max Kellerman was pushing in that post-fight interview. Bob says, I remember Steve Bunce calling him an idiot for the Chris John interview. Yeah, it was quite a long-running beef between Bunce and Kellerman. They definitely don't like each other. And like I say, Kellerman has a reputation in the industry for not being a very likable individual behind the scenes. A lot of people do not like that guy. But in a professional capacity, I've always liked Kellerman. Certainly in his HBO days, I liked him. You know, I'm able to separate the person from their work, from how they operate in a professional setting, from how they operate in their personal life, you know? And in a professional capacity, I always liked Max Kellerman as an analyst and as a commentator back in the HBO days. I thought he was great, to be honest. I liked the old HBO team back in the days. Kellerman, Merchant, Lampley, Manny Stewart, Roy Jones. Anyway, let's move on from Jai. I've already spoken about this fight, actually. Jared Anderson versus Solomon Dakers. Confirmed now. Also confirmed that Anderson has a co-promotional deal with Queensbury. And as I say, he'll be chief support against Dakers on the Wardley Dubois undercard. That fight is hurtling towards us. Be on the 9th of May. What are we now? 7 weeks out or something? 6 weeks out? Striker says, I haven't liked Kellerman since his debut on ESPN in the 90s. Yeah, I asked this question the other day in my Element group, Atavistic Intellect. He says, does Dana White's affiliation with Orange Man affect things with Zuffa and the Saudis? Yeah, I mean, it could. I mean, so to be specific, the question I asked was, does Dana's association and affiliation with Orange Man affect the passing of the Ali Revival or Reform Act, however they've worded it? Because Orange Man right now has got an enormous amount of political opposition, even within his own party, over this ridiculous move that he's made in the Middle East. That has led to an enormous backlash. His approval ratings are very low. Could it be that this Ali Revival Act won't go through ultimately because people want to spite Orange Man? Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm asking it as a question. Perhaps it will go through, all right? I'm just putting it out there as a possibility because, you know, in some cases, the political landscape can affect even something like boxing, right? Geopolitical landscape can affect things like a sport like boxing. So, I don't know. I'm sure there are people within US politics now that'll just be looking to, you know, block anything the Orange Man tries to do, no matter how insignificant it is in the grand scheme of things. You know, just the mentality just might be wherever this guy tries to get through, because we know he's friends with Dana White, we're going to block him and block his friends just because we can. Is that a possibility? I don't know. Guzi says, Orange Man is a fight fan. Why wouldn't he help Dana? Well, it's not a matter of him, though, is it? It's other politicians that are going to have a say in whether this actually gets approved. It's not just on Orange. If it gets to Orange Man's desk, of course he's going to approve it. But will it even get to Orange Man's desk? It's going to have to go through a bunch of other senators, right? Politicians, before it gets to Orange Man. If they approve it, then Orange Man gets the final approval. But maybe they won't approve. We'll see. Oscar De La Hoya apparently has been called to speak in front of the committee or whoever it is. Anybody see Oscar De La Hoya's latest Clapback Thursday? He said he's going to speak in front of them and state the case as to why it shouldn't go through. De La Hoya is a very well-known figure in the United States, obviously. Guzi says, for what I understand, his party owns the Congress and Senate until the upcoming midterm elections. Indeed, I don't doubt that, but he's being turned against. I mean, loads of members of his own party are turning against him right now over the situation in the Middle East. There's a mutiny against Orange Man. I mean, people have resigned and all sorts of stuff. So, I don't know, could that affect it? Maybe not, but I'm just throwing it out there as a question. In Circle says, I hope for the sake of the sport that it fails, and me too. me just check if we've got any other topics that I've got lined up here to talk about. Nope, we've got through everything that I had lined up. So we can just look forward to Itauma tomorrow against Jermaine Franklin. And also Sebastian Fundora, Keith Thurman. In fact, let me check who's on the undercard for that. I'm not sure I've checked before. Isn't it interesting? And, you know, they say that in boxing, you're only as old as the number of fights you've had. If you think about the fighters, the PBC guys of Thurman's generation, is he significantly younger than them? Like, is he significantly younger than Sean Porter, if at all? Is he younger than Spence, if at all? I forget. I think he is older than Spence, isn't he? Let me see if I can get the ages up here, because I want to make a point about wear and tear. So Keith Thurman is 37 years of age, same age as Luke Partridge now. How old is Sean Porter? Sean Porter is 38. Porter retired several years ago. Keith Thurman is still fighting. And again, the point I want to make here is chronological age obviously affects your athletic ability, reflexes, and so on. But what will accelerate your aging process as a fighter is the amount of damage you take, not just in terms of punches to the head, but the amount of wear and tear on your body. Keith Thurman had that period where he was away from boxing for a very long time. Loads of inactivity. We were all criticizing him and this, that, and the other. He went off and married some girl from Nepal. And he had like a traditional Nepalese wedding and he was playing flutes, wearing tie-dye t-shirts and all that stuff. But that might have actually prolonged his career. Whereas Sean Porter was fighting steadily throughout that period, Keith Thurman, because of that hiatus from boxing, he's able to last a little bit longer. Because here he is in a championship fight at the age of 37 against Fundora, coming off a win over Brock Jarvis, which, you know, that doesn't mean much. Brock Jarvis was never any great shakes. But yeah, I forgot to ask how old is, or answer the question. Look for the answer. How old is Errol Spence? I think he's younger than Thurman, isn't he? What is he, 35? 36? He's 36. So he's actually only a year younger than Thurman. But yeah, he's done. Sean Porter's done. But Keith Thurman still lingers on. Again, that time out of boxing has allowed him to prolong his career a bit. Yeah, that's right. Even I want to be careful saying certain names because of the algorithm, but even AJ, and we're not talking about the boxer, we're talking about the fat guy from Texas with the gravelly voice, who was Orange Man's biggest fanboy for the longest time. Even he's turned against Orange Man. Because what Orange Man has done is quite clearly not in the best interest of the United States, is it? Not to get too much into the geopolitical thing, but, you know, that's why so many of his supporters are turned against him, because the general perception is that he's not doing this for the US, he's doing it for another country, which I won't name, to the detriment of the United States. That's why this is such a wildly unpopular move. Anyway, I'm going to look at the undercard here for Fundora Thurman. Who have we got on it? Let's have a look. One sec, folks. All right. Yanili Hernandez, is that how you pronounce it, against Terrell Gausha. Yoenis Telez versus Brian Mendoza. Okay. So they got Mendoza on the card, all right? The guy who knocked out Fundora. Will that bring any ghosts back for Fundora, having Mendoza on the undercard? Maybe not, we'll see. Christian, gotta struggle with some of these names. Kangalosi, excuse me, against Miguel Hernandez. Kaipo Galios versus Julian Gonzalez. I have to confess, I do not know most of these people. You got Robert Guerrero Jr., who's the son of the Robert Guerrero that fought Keith Thurman and fought Floyd Mayweather. That Robert Guerrero with the hilarious dad, Ruben Guerrero. So it doesn't appear to be the greatest undercard in the world to me. There you go. Fundora, Keith Thurman top in the bill. And for the Itauma card, you got Liam Davis versus Francesco Grandielli. That's for the vacant European featherweight title. You got Willie Hutchinson, Ezra Taylor. We talked about that fight. I'm picking Hutchinson in that one. You got Shaquille Thompson versus Brad Pauls. That's for the IBF International middleweight title. Nathan Heaney versus Jerome Warburton, excuse me. Warburton, like the bread. Warburtons. He must be from up north with a name like Warburton. Okay, where is he? Oh, he's from Wales. Damn. The bread maker. He's a weird looking guy. But he's gone for the play on words there, the bread maker. You know, makes money. Name's Warburton. You get it. Michael Gomez Jr., Jordan Flynn, Nelson Birchall versus Ryan Grit. So it's not a great undercard either, to be fair. And Adam Hamed, I mean, who wants to watch him? Versus Michael Mooney. The Willie Hutchinson Ezra Taylor fight is interesting. Shaquille Thompson versus Brad Pauls. I've got no real interest in that fight, to be honest with you. No real interest in either of those fighters. What do you guys think? You like the undercard? Atomistic Intellect says, Hatman, I'm sure you're incredibly excited for the Caroline Dubois Terry Harper card. As Adam Smith would say, it's one of the biggest fights in years. Oh, Adam Smith. Pushing his silly nonsense. We know how he gets down. That's right, Telstar. Thurman had that soul-searching arc. That's how you could see it. That's right. He went on a soul journey. Gergen is fighting that guy that dropped Peril twice. Could be a barn burner. Remind me who Gergen is again? Is that a German heavyweight? Here's the thing encircled. He says, I wish Adam Smith will get a job where we don't have to hear him. The problem is that the standard of commentators in Britain is low. And it has been for, what, the past 20 years or so? At least 15 years. The last commentator in Britain who I really, really, really liked was Jim Watt. You got guys floating around now who are okay, you know, decent-ish. Barry Jones is cool. But there's no one in British commentary these days. And I'm talking about actual British people. Because you have had foreigners like Malinaji who was great and whatnot. But in terms of the actual British commentators, there's no one that I really think, oh yeah, he's great. People like Sonny Edwards. Bro, Sonny Edwards' voice is terrible. So he might make good points. But listening to that little pipsqueak voice, no. Just no. And what really kind of annoys me somehow is the way that Sonny Edwards keeps going between a London accent and a Birmingham accent constantly. That just really throws me off. Yeah, Carl Frampton's all right. Fernie G says, have you made a prediction for the main event? So to put my prediction out there, Fundora versus Thurman, I'm picking Sebastian Fundora for the win. I don't know if he's going to stop Thurman, because if Thurman has still got those legs, and it's a big if at 37, but if he's still got those legs, he might be able to survive the 12. So I'm definitely going for a Fundora win. I don't see Keith one-time Thurman winning the fight. If he does win, that'll be a hell of an upset, and maybe the best win of his whole career, all things considered, because Fundora's in his prime right now. Garcia wasn't in his prime when Thurman beat him, and you could argue that Sean Porter wasn't either. So, I mean, Porter wasn't too far removed from his prime, wasn't too far away from his prime. It probably wasn't at his absolute peak when Thurman beat him. So, yeah, you could definitely argue if Thurman pulls this off, that this is the best win of his career, especially given the size difference. You know, just to show the weigh-in again, the height difference is crazy. Look at that. How's Keith Thurman actually going to land on this guy's chin? Thurman might be 5'7". He might be listed at 5'8" or 5'9", but, you know, these guys exaggerate their heights in boxing a lot of the time. Not all of them, but some of them. A decent proportion of them. I reckon Thurman's 5'7". Fundora, 6'5", or 6'5.5". Massive height difference. Can Thurman bridge the gap? It's going to take a lot of athleticism and a lot of energy for Thurman to actually get close and land the shots. Yeah, Pac-Man beat Thurman. I always thought that Thurman fought the totally wrong fight against Pac-Man. If there was ever a fight... See, Thurman used to get criticized back in the days for moving a lot when he called himself one time. As in, he only has to hit you one time to knock you out. The fans instead gave him the name Runtime because he was constantly running around the ring. If ever there was a fight where he needed to use his legs, and where I expected him to use his legs, it was in the Pacquiao fight. But no, he turned up against Pacquiao, and he completely disregarded the use of his legs, and instead tried to put it on Pacquiao from early on. I thought that was a terrible, terrible mistake. A terrible tactical mistake. If you're in there against an old guy, you need to be moving around. Do you know what I mean? And Thurman's good at moving around. So, yeah, terrible tactical error. And this is why fighters shouldn't listen to fan expectation. Because the expectation from a lot of fans is that Thurman was supposed to go in there and blast Pacquiao out. And if he doesn't do that, if he doesn't do a job on Pacquiao, then it's like this big stain on Thurman's record. As a fighter, you can't listen to all that. You can't listen to all that. You have to go in there and just get the job done in the most sensible way. Not trying to appease fans or anything like that. Just get the job done in the most sensible way. Know who you are as a fighter. Know what your attributes are. Know what your opponent's attributes, strengths, and weaknesses are. And play to that. And Thurman showed over his championship career that his legs were one of his best assets. And he completely abandoned them in the Pacquiao fight. It's a terrible, terrible tactical decision. And it cost him. How tall is Mendoza? I think Mendoza's about 5'10". He's a bit taller than Keith Thurman. But that was at a time when Fundora was mixing it up on the inside a lot more. Because if you watch Fundora's last fight, the rematch with Tim Tszyu, he primarily fought that fight on the outside. In the first fight with Tszyu, he was mixing it up on the inside a lot. In the rematch, it was mainly on the outside. And I think that is part of the reason. I mean, obviously there's wear and tear with Tim Tszyu, but I think that's part of the reason why it was an easier fight for Fundora, because he used that height and reach to pin Tszyu on the outside and frustrate him. But when he fought Mendoza, you know, he was doing all this inside fighting and stuff like that, and that's what got him chinned. Lingered too long on the inside and gave Mendoza opportunities that he didn't need to give him. In Circle says, Adam Smith seems overly fond of everything. Oh, sorry, I forgot to finish my point regarding the commentary. So UK commentary generally is not great. When Eddie Hearn put together what he called the dream team, the game-changing team, which was totally ridiculous and just an example of how far gone Eddie Hearn was up his own backside at the time when he first did the UK DAZN deal, his lead commentator was Mike Costello. Mike Costello is just about the most dour, boring UK commentator I think I can ever remember. But for some bizarre reason, Eddie Hearn thought that this guy was like the best commentator in boxing. Or maybe he was just a friend of the family and Eddie Hearn wanted to pretend that he was the best commentator in boxing for that reason. I don't know. I've got no knowledge of whether they had a personal relationship, but all I can tell you is that Mike Costello was the most bland, dour, and dull UK commentator that I have maybe ever heard. Like, seriously. So going from him as lead commentator to Adam Smith is actually an upgrade. It's not saying much because Smith is pretty insufferable at times, but it's actually a step up. It's actually an upgrade from Costello, because Costello is just, oh dear. Yeah, he was awful. Craig Roche Boxer says, that was the point. I was like, bring back Adam Smith. All is forgiven. Atomistic Intellect says Mike Costello was like grabbing a guy out of an IT office and making him a boxing commentator. Yeah, something like that. Chris Santos says, I think Fundora gets the KO in the 7th. I wouldn't argue with you. I think Fundora can get the KO. It all depends on how much energy Thurman has still got in those legs. Does he have the energy to survive the 12? To stay away from Fundora? Because Fundora is a stick insect. And a stick insect like that, if he has to chase somebody down, he's not going to look particularly graceful, is he? Vengeance says, do you remember Nick Calling? Yes, I do. And I tell you what, Nick Calling was a hell of a lot more entertaining than Mike Costello. I remember Nick Calling. Nick Calling was the lead commentator for AJ versus Dylan White and many other Sky fights at the time. What do I make of Duke McKenzie's commentary? Do you mean his analysis or his commentary? Because I don't remember Duke McKenzie commentating on a fight for decades. But I like his analysis. I like his predictions, particularly for heavyweight boxing. Got a great prediction record. He picked Holyfield to beat Mike Tyson in their first fight, which was an incredible pick. He was in the Sky studio working as a pundit when he made that pick. Crazy. Very, very few people picked Holyfield in that fight. Yeah, I like Todd Grisham as well. I've heard some people say he's terrible, they hate Todd Grisham. Different strokes for different folks. But personally, I think Todd Grisham's all right. I like his energy. He might not be the most knowledgeable boxing guy in the world, but that's only part of what makes a commentator, at least for me. Yeah? Mike Costello was knowledgeable, but his personality and his voice and everything was just so dull, I couldn't listen to the guy. So when I say that I like a commentator, it isn't just because they have boxing knowledge. You know, they have to have a voice and a personality and what have you that keeps me entertained. And I think Todd Grisham has got a very good voice. He's got this very kind of upbeat, animated type voice. So yeah, I like him. And I think that the American DAZN team have actually gelled over time quite well. So they have these contrasting personalities which do kind of bounce off each other and work fairly well. So they've got Grisham, they've got the Latin Snake, Sergio Mora, and then they've got Mannix doing the scorecards. Mannix is basically the antagonist of the team. Mannix is the one who's going to say the most stupid stuff. And it can be frustrating at times. Mannix is going to be the one who sometimes comes up with ridiculous scorecards. That maybe is a problem. Maybe they should just keep Mannix as the interviewer, because his interviewing ability is relatively good. But as far as like Grisham and Sergio Mora, I reckon they've gelled quite well. As much as Mannix can say stupid stuff, I like the fact that they've got Mora there to call him out on the stupid stuff he says. I quite like the back and forth between Mora and Mannix. Like Mora will often blatantly troll Mannix to his face and say all sorts of stuff about him on air and, and what have you. And I quite like that dynamic there. Atomistic Intellect says, I like having Mannix there, to be honest. It's entertaining. And Circle says, Sergio Mora also likes to babble in the stupid. Didn't he say Fury's defense would be too good for Usyk? Or dabble in the stupid, excuse me. Yeah, he did. He was, but you know, a lot of knowledgeable boxing people were taken in by the whole Partridge act, especially in America. Because in America, they kind of live in a little bit of a bubble where they still imagine America to be the center of the boxing universe. And if you've won big fights in America, it must mean that you're above fighters who haven't won big fights in America. And in the heavyweight division, that's a particularly ridiculous perception to have, because America hasn't been the home of heavyweight boxing for decades now. So Mora kind of fell into that trap. So did Teddy Atlas, of overrating Luke Partridge, aka Tyson Fury, just because he'd won some big fights in America. They overrated him. They went overboard. Even Malignaggi did, by the way. Yeah, Malignaggi fell into the trap of overrating Partridge too. Malignaggi is a great analyst and a great commentator. So I don't think it was a specifically Sergio Mora issue. It was a much broader issue among American boxing media and boxing fans, which was a result of their perception that they're still the center of the boxing universe. Yeah, a lot of them went way overboard with Partridge. Vibes Not Found says, Mora did say Anthony Yarde was going to use his Philly shell to beat Benavidez during the fight. Yeah, but he never picked Anthony Yarde to win, though, did he? I'm sure he picked Benavidez to win. So I assume what he was saying is that Anthony Yarde is going to try to win using the Philly shell. Not that he would win using the Philly shell, but that he would try. And indeed, he did try. It all went horribly wrong, obviously. Yeah, I totally disagree with Vengeance. I thought Larry Merchant was very, very knowledgeable about boxing and had, to be honest with you, probably the best understanding of the sport of anyone that I've seen who's never actually boxed. Like, Larry Merchant understood things about the way fighters feel in the ring, about the psychology of fighters and stuff like that, which, again, most people who haven't boxed don't have. Because when you're dealing with people that have never boxed, so for example, growing up, when I was boxing as an amateur, most of my friends had never boxed. And when they would watch boxing matches, they would say the most stupid stuff you could possibly imagine. You know, they'd see someone get dropped or knocked out and they'd say, oh my God, how could he box? How could you just get knocked out like that? You know, they would be laughing and mocking guys for getting knocked out. And I mean, they just had no idea what they were looking at. That's an extreme example. But then you get people who have never boxed that analyze the sport and imagine themselves not only in the body of the fighter, but in the mind of the fighter. And they're looking at the way fighters react to certain situations, why they do things the way that they do. And again, Larry Merchant never laced up a pair of gloves in his life, but for someone that's never boxed, he had a very, very good understanding of the way fighters think and why they do the things they do. So yeah, I got to disagree with Vengeance on that one. I thought Larry Merchant was excellent, to be honest. And I liked Larry Merchant's analogies, indeed, when he would do his little monologues before the fight and after the fight. No, I totally disagree. Merchant was great. He was a great analyst and a great boxing mind. I mean, I remember during the Tua Ibeabuchi fight, in the early going, Ibeabuchi came out extremely fast. And one of the commentators said, well, he's extremely confident coming out this fast against the puncher like Tua. And Merchant said, well, possibly, but sometimes when a fighter comes out and throws hands like this, it's actually because he's not confident. And that was a great point that he made. Yeah, sometimes a guy will come out and throw a million punches because he's not confident. Because he's actually nervous. See, a nervous fighter will go usually one of two ways. He'll either come out and throw nothing and freeze, or he'll come out and throw too many punches. It depends on the personality type in terms of how they deal with nerves. But for some people, nerves will equal hyperactivity, and they'll just fly at you with a million shots because they're so nervous. That nervous energy is causing them to be reckless and all that kind of thing. Whereas for other fighters, that nervousness will just cause them to shut down completely and they won't be able to get any punches off. So that's just an example of the kind of thing kind of points he would make. Well, yeah, he might be confident throwing the shots he's throwing like that against Tua, but you might actually be nervous. That might be the reason he's throwing all these punches. Perfect example, Fernie G. Perfect example. You couldn't have picked a better example than that. He says Peter McNeely versus Mike Tyson. That is the perfect example of a nervous fighter who came out like a bull in a china shop. Thank you for that. That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. A guy who was hella nervous and it manifested in this hyper aggression. Indeed, that's another thing I liked about Larry Merchant. He would be critical of the stuff HBO was airing. Yeah, that's another thing I liked about it. I like Steve Albert as well. Yes, 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 yes. Atomistic Intellect says, I know this will be controversial, but I actually like Freddie Pacheco. Something about the guy just makes me laugh. Yeah, from an entertainment perspective, I like Pacheco as well. Pacheco did say some ridiculous stuff on commentary, but he was quite entertaining. He was an interesting and entertaining character. And yeah, Steve Albert I did like. But again, there's a culture in American sports broadcasting at the corporate level of not just picking commentators based on their knowledge, not just picking commentators based on who they know, but picking commentators based on their entertainment value and their voice. Yeah? You think about American commentators in NFL, in basketball, as well as boxing. So many of them have got these really powerful, distinctive, commanding voices. Just great broadcast voices. Very rarely do you get UK commentators who have great broadcast voices. Very rarely, in boxing anyway. And if I was in charge at corporate level, with one of these broadcasters, I would definitely prioritize having commentators, employing commentators with good broadcast voices. I think it's an underrated thing, at least for me anyway, from my perspective. Striker says, I'll disagree on Pacheco. Listening to him and Bobby Ches sucked. The combination of the two of them absolutely sucked. They did commentary, I think, for, was it Showtime for the first Holyfield Tyson fight? Yeah, that sucked. But Pacheco with Steve Albert, I thought was actually a pretty good combination. Steve Albert had that great voice, and Pacheco would be nattering away like an uncle. But I quite liked that combination, to be fair. Yeah, Ches was legitimately awful because he was such a fanboy, and he was also an unbelievably egotistical person, and that egotistical personality would come across in his commentary a lot of the time. I remember when Bobby Ches started calling out Frank Bruno and really insulting Bruno, saying he's got no heart, he's a bum, this, that, and the other. Maybe he was just angling for a payday, I don't know. But I really got the impression that he believed what he said about Bruno. I mean, Bruno would have toyed with Bobby Chet. Unbelievable. So I was quite elated when Corey Sanders obliterated Bobby Ches. Bobby Ches was just such an annoying, dislikable character. Yeah, he was a massive Mike Tyson fanboy, like to an embarrassing extent. It was so embarrassing what a Mike Tyson fanboy he was. How can you have a Mike Tyson fanboy commentating on Mike Tyson fights? Shocker. Yeah, I did like Jim White as well. Lampley was great. He's not great anymore because Father Time has caught up with him. He doesn't flow the way he used to. You know, he's getting up there in age. Don't know if he drinks, but yeah, Lampley's not what he used to be, unfortunately. We've forgotten about Harold Letterman. Okay, Jim. The iconic Okay, Jim. People were actually printing out Okay, Jim t-shirts. You guys remember that? Okay, Jim. The Circle says, I don't think Lampley is bad. I'll take Lampley over Adam Smith. Well, I have to disagree on that. Lampley was awful. The past couple times I heard him on commentary. Very slow. His brain just don't function very fast anymore. He was making loads of mistakes. I was like, nah, man, this is a shadow of the former Jim Lampley, the shadow of his old self, you know. Lampley back in the days had a great voice, tremendously entertaining. But now it's like, oh no, he's he's washed. He's going the way of Larry Merchant, because it reached the point where Larry Merchant was so slow in his speech that they had to cut him from the team. It's just too slow. And that's now happening to Jim Lampley as well. He's getting slower and slower and slower. And it's just, it's not working. Yeah, he was terrible on the Times Square card. I agree with Craig, Welsh boxer. He was terrible. He's too slow now. Atavistic Intellect says Gil Clancy was good. He was good with the HBO team. Personally, I was never really a fan of Gil Clancy. A bit of an annoying character, for me anyway. So, someone says, Harold was a great drunk boxing analyst back in the day. He had a bottle of whiskey under the desk. Okay, Jim. Red-faced. I remember they used to do a little segment with Harold Letterman where he was literally in a bar talking about boxing. He was one of the great old boxing characters, Letterman, along with people like, God, why have I forgotten his name? The guy who used to smoke cigars with the hat on and all that. Famous old American boxing journalist. Why have I forgotten his name? He's so famous. The cigar smoking, hat wearing guy. God, what was his name? Why have I forgotten his name? It's been so long. Bert Sugar, thank you. Bert Sugar. Yes, Bert Sugar. He's one of the old great boxing characters as well. Yeah, I agree with that, Encircled. I hate how toxic positivity has infected UK commentary. And that back and forth, actually, Striker says, Foreman had some incredibly goofy takes as a commentator, but he was so likable. And there was always the back and forth between Foreman and Larry Merchant. And that was quite entertaining. When Merchant and Foreman used to go back and forth, that was funny. Because Foreman would say something really weird or goofy, and it would always be Larry Merchant that would pull him up on it. Like, that doesn't make sense, George. Like, and you could tell that George was always annoyed by being pulled up by Larry Merchant. You know what I mean? And he'd always He'd always pull rank and say, hang on, I've boxed and you haven't. So you wouldn't understand. But they always had a great back and forth, George Foreman and Larry Merchant. And some of the things occasionally that Foreman said did make sense when he explained them. Have I seen the ITV commentary for Tony Tucker, Buster Douglas, and Jim starts going on a rant about fat fighters, sly dissing Buster Douglas? Well, that was quite common back then for commentators to diss fighters for being fat. I mean, Jim Watt's commentary partner for years on ITV was Reg Gutteridge. And I remember him saying that, because back then it was mostly American heavyweights that you'd see coming in overweight. Not the majority of them, but, you know, a good proportion of them. People like Tony Tubbs, people like David Bay, people like, who else was there now? Michael Dokes and others who come in blubbery and whatnot. I remember Reg Gutteridge during one of, it was some American fight he was commentating on. And Reg Gutteridge said, some of these American fighters would qualify for wearing a bra or words to that effect. So commentary back then was very different. It was better. It was more unfiltered. The commentators just said what they really thought. They weren't on eggshells and all that kind of stuff. In America, it's still the case even now, to some extent. Whereas in Britain, it's become like ultra PC. You know, super ultra PC commentary. And that was even there prior to the whole woke thing. Yeah, UK commentaries, well, not always, but certainly for the majority of the past 15, 20 years, it's been super duper PC. Very, very PC. Yeah, I remember that too. The cornerman you're talking about, Chris Santos, is Norman Stone, aka Stoney. And he was a bizarre, very bizarre, extremely fiery character, Norman Stone. And yeah, Larry Merchant tore him a new one. That was hilarious as well when Larry Merchant did that. Norman Stone was crazy. I remember when John Ruiz fought Nikolai Valoev in Germany, and Norman Stone, he must have been well into his 60s or 70s at the time, decided to basically start a fight after John Ruiz didn't get the decision. I'm like, how can a guy of that age, I mean, he was like, in fact, you know, people talk about John Fury, Johnny Partridge. Norman Stone was more extreme, if you can imagine that. Norman Stone was like, I mean, he was nowhere near as big as Johnny Partridge, but he was a similar kind of character, but more extreme. I mean, dear, oh dear, Norman Stone. The man was an idiot. It was hilarious to watch at times because he was so crazy. But yeah, he almost makes Johnny Partridge looked like a choir boy with the way that he would behave. It was so ridiculous. Yeah, that's another annoying thing with UK commentary. Craig Roachboxer says, I hate it when the commentary apologize for swearing in the corner, even though it's 4 a.m. Yeah, that's terribly annoying when they do that. When a show is past the watershed, do they even have a watershed in UK television anymore? I don't know. But there used to be a watershed, which meant that after a particular time at night, television programs are allowed to have swearing or cursing, as they call it in America, right? I think it might have been like 9 p.m. or something. Was that the watershed back in the days? If there's a watershed now, what time is it? And if a fight is occurring past that time, then why on earth should they not, Why on earth should they be apologizing for swearing? It's past the watershed. What's the problem? Weird. Don Gorgon says, Tunde's live commentary in his watch-along was top quality. He called every shot. It was like an old radio commentator. He should quit being a trainer and switch to comms every other time. Yeah, I totally disagree. I find, and this is no shade at Tunde, all right? But I find Tunde's commentary to be absolutely terrible. I'll give you a demonstration of Tunde's commentary, literally. Right hand from this one, left hand, right hand, left hand, right hand, left hand. Oh, jab, 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 move, jab, 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 jab. Right hand, left hand, juve, move, uppercut. I mean, that is what he does throughout the whole of a fight. There's no like analysis of what's going on. He just literally describes what's going on with no analysis whatsoever. Screaming, right hand, left hand, uppercut, oh, move, feint, left hand, right hand. It's like, bro, that's not commentary. That's a reaction. That's not actually commentary. That's just a reaction. Because you're supposed to be like describing what's going on and also giving your thoughts on what's going on. This guy needs to do this, or he needs to do that, or he needs to watch out for this. But all Tunde does is just say, right and left hand, feint, jab, move, oh, uppercut. I mean, like, nah, bro. I find his commentary terrible. But hey, to each his own. If Don Gorgon likes it, it's not for me to say that he shouldn't. But personally, I find it terrible. I think it would actually be better if it was Tunde who only spoke between rounds, because basically what they do is Tunde will do the quote-unquote commentary during the rounds, and then Spencer Fearon will give some analysis in the 1 minute between rounds. I think they need to reverse that. They need to invert that. I think it needs to be Fearon doing the commentary during the rounds and just restrict Tunde to the minute break between rounds. Then you might get something a bit more entertaining and useful, you know? Spencer Fearon's probably going to make some good points about what's going on. Not just this manic Nigerian guy talking about, oh, left, right, move, feint, left, uppercut, oh, jab, move back. Like, no, man. I can't do it. Guzi says, you know, this is going to get back to Tunde. Yeah, probably. Oh, dear. Craig Roseboxer says, commentary should be insightful. I want them to spot something I've missed. Exactly that. Again, I don't really class what Tunde does as commentary. All it is basically a reaction. It's kind of like what KSI used to do, you know? Or some of these other YouTubers. They just react. It's like a live reaction. It's not really commentary. Because commenting is you're literally talking about something. Whereas what Tunde does is he's just describing what is happening. He's not commenting on it. He's not giving his thoughts about what he's seeing. So I don't know whether it's possible, but if Tunde and Spencer could swap roles and have Spencer doing the commentary during the rounds and Tunde talking in between rounds, I reckon that'd be better. Because Spencer Fearon's a pretty good commentator. I've heard him do commentary over the years on some fights here and there. He's a pretty good commentator. But you can't get a word in edgeways with Tunde, you know? Can't get a word in edgeways. Encircle says, who is that halfwit on TalkSport? You're talking about Spencer Oliver? All right, peeps, I'm going to bring this one to a close. Been streaming for nearly 3 hours now. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed the conversation this evening. I certainly have. So I'd like to thank each and every one of you for locking in. With a special shout out to those who donated via Super Chat. They were Luca, Gaz, Linkage, Matt Borgerson, Lone Wolf Boxing, and D-Man. All right, those are the guys who contributed via Super Chat, excuse me. Until next time, you guys take care, be good. I'll catch you on the other side. I can't guarantee live commentary for the Itauma fight tomorrow night, but it's a possibility. So stay tuned. Anyway, catch you guys on the next one. I'm out.